You're listening to Tune Dig, a conversation between two lifelong friends about the power of music, one album at a time. I'm Cliff Seal.
And I'm Kyle Stapleton. Each episode, we talk about a single album in depth, unpacking it through conversation to understand what makes it worth appreciating and learning a little bit about life along the way.
If you're listening for the first time because we're covering an artist or a record you love, we promise you'll learn something new or gain a new perspective by the end of the episode.
And if you've stuck with us for multiple episodes, you know by now that you're bound to expand your horizons as we share clear entry points for artists you may never have tried to get into before.
Today we're talking about Tidal by Fiona Apple.
There's a million reasons to talk about a Fiona Apple album, especially coming off 2020, where I would, for maybe the first time in recent history, post Kanye breakup with Pitchfork. Pitchfork agrees with some other people that like Fiona Apple put out the best album of 2020, period. Fetch the Bolt Cutters.
I am finding a theme this season. There's always like a new small thing about music and the way that I enjoy it that unfolds with every batch of albums that we cover. And this season, I think every episode I've referenced some like canonical text that I've said, here is an excellent piece of writing that illuminated pretty much everything that I wanted to say or was trying to articulate and couldn't find the perspective on. That tells me two things. One, in general, it tells me that writing and let's call it good music criticism, thoughtful, dispassionate music criticism is almost as valuable as the art itself. These artifacts of music are super important, but so is our shared understanding of them, trying to put words to why these things move us in a direction. Two, specifically on this album, because Fiona is so volcanically intimate and vulnerable. She's kind of a contradiction in terms in feeling, and she contains so many multitudes. I think it takes an equally vulnerable, personal type of perspective to really appreciate it. So to me, the canonical text on Fiona, both with Tidal and with Fetch the Bolt Cutters, which I think bookend each other really nicely, is Jen Pelly for Pitchfork. And she wrote about how Sleep to Dream changed her life, upended her whole shit when she was a teenager, and then gave an extremely rare perfect 10 for Pitchfork and wrote that review for Fetch the Bolt Cutters. And both things are warranted, and both things are just objectively beautifully written pieces of music literature. But it is interesting because the words around Fiona have changed so much in what is objectively not a long time in history. And I know there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. And to that point, not only the Pitchfork writing that you pointed out, but in general, and I think maybe a stance, for lack of a better term, that we can take here, seek out the female identifying stories about Fiona Apple's Tidal.
Please, God, yes.
And I mean that like literally and directly, because one of the reasons that I think it's worth talking about Tidal, aside from the fact that like, if she released Album of the Year in 2020, you might think, well, the thing that she released as a debut when she was 19 years old, when she had never performed before, is probably not very good. And you'd be very wrong about that.
Could not be more wrong.
So aside from that kind of like surface level thing, I think me and you talk a lot about the kind of, I don't know if we've said it this way, but like the co-creation of a cultural moment and a touchstone that happens because, to your point, music comes out, but the response to the music that comes out along with it co-creates that moment. The reviews of albums at the time shape the way that the album itself gets perceived over time. And it's a real trip to see that, especially for albums that vary in age from something like this that was just in the 90s, where we also kind of had a trip with it with Melvins, and then compare it to like a record we'll do later, like Bitches Brew, seeing it half a century later and seeing how people talked about it then. It's important to remember that, especially if you haven't picked up an album lately, like an older album, picked it back up and kind of put it in your own modern context, sometimes albums get stuck and the weird little cultural hangups that happen at the same time that they come out. And like, I think Tidal deserves an extraction from, quite frankly, like a narrative driven by men and a very masculine mentality towards the music that she wrote on this album and the way that she presented herself as an otherwise like very young adult who was very talented.
And the first time that you brought that up in our message exchange, that really struck a chord with me coming out of 2020, where so many things happened where we had a very clear reaction to what was happening out there in the world. And then the narrative around, like, there's so much talk around narrative right now, right? And history being written by the victors. And too often the victors are these fucking reptiles. And a lot of that microcosmically happened to Fiona Apple. And it happened in big ways and in a lot of the language and kind of subconscious shaping of the narrative around her and just what to make of this super intense album from an 18-year-old, which is still unfathomable to me. Like puka shell wearing flip-flop bro, high school 18-year-old Kyle. I'm not capable of any shit approaching Tidal now in my mid 30s, let alone when I was 17, 18 years old. So I'm just absolutely floored by what I hear now, removed from the first time I heard it when we were much younger. But it's also in little things. Like I did a quick scan of top 100 albums of the 90s list, and take all of those with a grain of salt, whatever. But she doesn't appear, this record doesn't appear on a number of them. It's very low on the Rolling Stone one, where I would have figured for sure it was a shoe-in for like the top 20. It's number 83. I don't even know that it's our place to do this, but I really want to strongly, like, I just figured this had a higher place in the canon than it did because of Fetch the Bolt Cutters and because of recency bias and just being like, aren't we all bowled over by Fiona Apple? But I was kind of stunned. I'm stunned by the quality of the music and the songwriting. I'm doubly stunned when I realized how young she was and that it was her first effort and that it basically all just erupted from her as a single human person. And the only help she had was polishing the edges. And then I'm triply stunned that it wasn't a collective holy shit moment for the whole universe in the 90s. So just let us be one Google search result. If you like Sleep and if you like Death Grips and if you're a poisonous dude who looks like us, but maybe doesn't think like us and is listening to this podcast. Hopefully this is an episode that will urge you to reconsider as a music fan, right? Because this is the space, music is the space where you get to be really open-minded and exploratory. And I knew that I would enjoy picking this record back up, but like, I hope everybody in the world will listen to this record type of advocate.
Yeah, right? And it takes like 1 to 2 listens to get there from zero.
Yep.
Yeah.
So my wife and I just had a baby. You know this, but everyone listening probably doesn't. And the hospital is in our hometown. It's not nearby us. So it's about a 45-minute drive. And Tidal is 51 minutes. So the drive, I would get almost exactly all the way through Tidal on this drive. And there's just so many moments over the past couple of months where I've been on the highway, just like, whoa, dude, what? Whoa. There are so many little moments, and I know we're going to get into just talking about it structurally, musically, but that was the first thing that really struck me was there are so many surprises moment to moment within a song. It's a really beautiful piece of jazz architecture in that way, flooring.
Yeah, and we'll get to say this about Bitches Brew too, so like spoiler alert, because I've been thinking a lot about that record too, but like Tidal rewards focus active listening in a way that you would not expect based on the genre and timing of this album. And the reason, I think, I'll posit a reason, I guess, it's not really the type of active listening that is rewarded by musical complexity, right? The layers, the production, like I want to hear every detail. I want to hear like Jimmy Page's wrist accidentally touching the guitar strap type stuff. This is not that. So this is not the same type of active listening as especially records that were coming out in the 60s and 70s that were the gold rush of figuring out that we could layer things on top of one another and cut tape, right? This is not that type of active listening. It's another one. And it's the one that really caught me off guard because, to be honest, there was so much I wanted to say about this record and so many stories I wanted to uplift, to your point, to whether it's our place or not. I don't know, but we're going to elevate female voices and like deconstruct some of the bad shit that got talked about related to this record. But like, it was kind of like one day it occurred to me that what was different about the active listening experience is like actually her insight. The music is supporting for lack of a better term, like her prose at every step throughout this whole process. And I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit later. Like, I want to mention some places that really gets drawn out. And I think it's definitely related to the choice to make this, in most cases, a piano driven album. But all that kind of to the side, it's not the layer, it's not the surprise sound that you're listening for. It's like, it's shockingly cerebral. You'll forget immediately that she is, by the way, anywhere from 14 to 18 having written these songs, right? Sleep to Dream was written when she was like 14 or 15 years old.
Which what the shit?
Which is wild, because it's a great song, you know?
And it's so lived in. This record is so beyond its years that you're like, who occupied your consciousness in your past life? I mean, it's just, it's heavy. How do you feel that stuff at that age, period?
Jumping ahead a little bit, I think that there's a little bit of a theory, though, because she was definitely born into a family of musicians.
Sure.
Like, it will surprise you none to learn that she was absorbed in the world of music. And yeah, it's worth saying too, that probably greased the skids for her to get this demo into the hands of a producer and end up signing a record deal before she had ever performed live before. But that also, and I think we'll maybe come back to that moment, but like, that speaks to the power of what she was able to accomplish right then. And I think when you grow up around musicians the way that someone like Fiona Apple does, where like from the moment you're born, right, you're surrounded by people who are good at it, all of a sudden music starts moving further into that kind of unconscious zone in a way that it doesn't necessarily when you're just like learning an instrument, even over decades. All of a sudden you're absorbing music. You're almost like waterlogged in it. I'm sure you're listening to it all the time. You're watching, you're paying attention. And so like she ends up a little bottle rocket like at this age. But the difference that's again worth pointing out and like extracting from the cultural moment is that like she is neither just like an angsty teen with a thesaurus figuring out how to write a decent turn of phrase every now and then, which, you know, was well beyond her years at this age in general. But then secondly, I want to just go ahead and say it directly so that we don't have to keep talking about it, because I worry that this is why Tidal is too far down the top 100 list. And that's that, like, because part of Fiona Apple's story was childhood rape and abuse. And because that does come up in a really light sense in at least one song, choosing to take especially an 18, 19-year-old who just released some of their first music, heartfelt songs written about real life experience. And then it seems like both thinking back to that time as much as I can, even though we were young, and then definitely rereading about it now, like so many people want this to be her album about her childhood trauma. And that's not what this record is. And it doesn't deserve to be considered that way from anyone who might have been around when this record came out and who watched it be oversimplified into kind of what I just mentioned, plus, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the definite lack of nuance in responding to things like her criminal music video, things like that. I mean, she was almost immediately reduced back to her trauma as an artist as soon as she came out of the gate. And the benefit of being 20, 30 years down the road, I guess, or the benefit of just being a decent person, like we want to lift this record up out of that and say that was probably not the right way to think about this record or experience it or listen to these songs. So let's like shed that and try to build up a different world instead that'll kind of help us hear it better.
Well, and we saw that with D'Angelo too, right? He just smoked weed and worked out and then became a sex symbol. And he was like, wait, I just made the greatest album of the decade. So hold on, just please listen to that and don't look at my abs. And again, it goes back to narrative. And I have been so preoccupied with that thought for so long that all we want is to be seen and known for all of our complexity and contradictions when it's us, but when it's other people, even when we're aware of that thought with ourselves, we have an instinct to flatten people into that narrative, right? She is a Lolita. D'Angelo is a sex symbol. Bjork is a weirdo. Death Grips is whatever. I hope that the larger lesson beyond music that is a teachable moment from this album is in 2021, whatever is remaining of it at this point, that you will take a step back and try to coexist with somebody else's multitudes, especially if they challenge you, because that is the best thing about Fiona Apple at every phase is she stretches emotion into taffy, and there's a whole spectrum of it. There's 3 whole dimensions of it to like look through and poke around with. And I mean, you touched on so much in that last little bit. Lyrically, I hate to say I'm so jealous, but especially thinking back to being a teenager and like how badly I wanted to be a good writer. I remember we had the most challenging and best teacher that I ever had in high school was this guy, Mr. Craig. And he taught AP literature, and we would read these really challenging passages. We'd read something like E. Cummings or something like that. And it was so deconstructed and raw, but it was so perfect and encapsulated the way that it was. And I get the same sensation reading Fiona Apple lyrics as I'm listening along as when I was trying to deconstruct like E. Cummings. And it looks so deceptively simple, but then you go to read, just like the way she constructs phrases together just absolutely take my breath away. There are 2 real levels that I think separately you can get into with this record immediately. Again, set aside the fact that she's 18. That's the cherry on top. The music itself and the complexity and kind of the propulsion, I think that's the thing that sets it apart musically, is there's a momentum to all these songs, even the slow ones that are kind of reflective of her mania and her energy that we would come to see from her as an artist. And the production is perfect, but I think the production is a tool to support, like you said, the prose, the voice. Lyrically, everything about this is holy shit, just start to finish. And there are a bunch of moments that I would love to point out. But I think I would just start by saying the lyrics should be a bound book. They should be a leather cover bound book that you should have in your house and love and appreciate, with small print of the text surrounded by a lot of negative space. And you should sit with them. I see a lot of Rupi Kaur poems on Instagram. This is like that, but with a stunning Coltrane-like technical complexity. So I'm very appreciative that she is able to pull all of that out of herself all at once. I think typically you see more one or the other in one direction, right? They're more musical or more lyrical. That's all there, I think, is where it's like, why is she at number 83 when you consider all of this came from her? I'm going to get progressively angrier as this episode goes on. Just going back to thinking that thought, like, who's centered in these lists? Who gets to make these lists? Why the fuck is Built to Spill number 17 on this list and this record is 83?
I'm writing my protest signs now. We're going to stand outside just like, what you doing? Related to that, like what really struck me is the appreciation of she's able in these lyrics not only to write things that are truly good enough to stand on their own without the music, like you've pointed out, true, good, actual, thoughtful poetry. It is at the same time that, and thematically universal enough to capture the attention of MTV viewers.
Right.
There's a weird layer that's hard to really verbalize when we're trying to distinguish between someone who is a good artist and is able to be like universally acclaimed or accessible versus someone like this, we'll continue to see as we like pull out some quotes, knows for absolute certain how to do it and does it with almost a level of ease, but certainly self-awareness of, I know what song I am writing. I know how deep I want this to go. I know how I want it to feel. And I am able to detect how close or far I am from it being a pop song. Basically, it's unexplainable outside of, at that point, she had nearly 2 decades of just music, talented music surrounding her at all times to where she could start to intuit things like that as opposed to having to think through them or write them out.
And a lot of the sentiments that she shares, it's the dexterity with which she can kind of do these things so naturally. Like I got the sensation reading the lyrics that, so like LeBron James is LeBron James now, and he has 20 years of being the single best basketball player, if not athlete, other than Serena Williams, let's say, in the world. But you can also go back and watch high school footage of LeBron and know that, holy shit, this guy could go out on an NBA team and put up a triple-double potentially right now. There's a lot of that where you're just like, I don't think I want to watch anybody else play basketball for a little while. I think about a song like Shadow Boxer. I think about the girls that we knew growing up who were big Fiona Apple fans who would like put Fiona Apple quotes on their Zynga or their live journal. And even in the hands of it being photocopied, it flattened it. It just lost some of that punch when girls you knew who were good writers or anyone was like, this is great and this represents me. There's something about the way that she sands the edges of a song like Shadow Boxer and that metaphor of the sparring of a relationship. That would be a really clunky metaphor in the other 9 out of 10 people's hands.
Oh, your gaze is dangerous, and you fill your space so sweet. If I let you get too close, you'll set your spell on me.
But she picks just the right turn of phrases to make that work in and out. So you have the stuff that could be ham-handed, like a Shadow Boxer, like a Criminal. And then you have something like Slow Like Honey, which sits right at the middle of the record. And again, floors me that someone who is a teenager, this sounds like a song that, I don't know, I can't even think of an artist, but somebody that had 40 years worth of love songs and stories behind them, right? And you can only write a song like this in the rear view. Where does something with the specificity of you yield to me like a scent in the breeze and you wonder what it is about me? It's my big secret keeping you coming, slow like honey, heavy with mood. And then to know to draw those syllables out legato over the piano and the stand-up bass and the jazz drums, and to kind of let that dance like a ribbon is just, sometimes I feel, a long time ago, you and I talked about, we have a no conjecture rule on this podcast where we can't just death spiral into, holy shit, this is the greatest thing of all time.
Yeah.
But only Fiona has good enough words for Fiona. I feel like I just feel like I hit the asymptote pretty quickly. And I just want to point immediately back to her. It's just like, go get your brains blown of this.
So I stretch myself across like a bridge, and I pull you to the edge. Stand there waiting, trying.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. This album had the same effect that Listen to Homogenic did, in that literal sense of like, no, I think I'm just gonna listen to this for a while.
Yep.
No, I'm good.
Yep.
For days at a time. So I would love to talk about that, and specifically jumping off the part that you mentioned in there about like how it feels like there's like 40 years worth of experience built into this. Because I think with minimal backstory, and then a little bit of, I want to kind of talk about like what she is doing with the music and kind of draw out what you were just saying about the way that she chooses to use her vocals on top of the music to do things, because effectively, like, she's guiding this whole album by the hand. We are only going at the pace that she is comfortable with, and you can feel it in certain songs. But like, to your earlier statement, the quote from Andrew Slater, who was the producer, who did really good work on this album, actually, but he got Fiona's demo. Again, requisite mentioning of like very connected music people can make things happen for each other, like Taylor Swift.
But I do want to point out that I think a perfect microcosm of the Fiona Apple story is she at once knows her power and is quick to not overstate it. Again, in a very sort of LeBron James way. She made 78 copies of that demo and was quote unquote prepared to hustle it. And then the very first one went to her friend that then got into Andrew Slater's hands, who immediately recognized the power of it and was like, holy shit. And like put together a whole group of musicians to work around it. There's something really interesting in the pull between those forces to me. It's like, of course, this is great and it's going to be good. Connection or no connection. This was inevitable.
No, I just always feel like, as a person who previously tried to do music for a little bit and knowing a ton of people who try to do music for a living, I always feel like it's helpful to remember that, like, yeah, a lot of people do actually have a lot more connections than you do, and it's
Sure.
really hard
Sure.
if you don't know
Yeah,
people.
that's true.
But that said, so Andrew Slater gets this demo, like you mentioned, and his quote was, "I cannot believe that this was written and sung by a 17-year-old. It sounded like a 30-year-old singer who had written a lifetime's worth of material. I thought someone was playing a joke on me." Which, like, you can kind of even feel it because, yeah, like if you try to even put yourself in the mind of someone listening to a demo that has this artist on it, and someone is telling you, like, this is basically a child, you know?
This is the opposite of Chris Gaines, where you're like, wait, Garth Brooks is doing what? This is surprise good Chris Gaines, where you don't know anything about the person, and then you find out
Oh my
it's a
God.
teenager, and you're like, I've wasted my whole life.
Thank you for bringing chaotic, neutral Chris Gaines to my attention. I appreciate it.
There's a great Childish Gambino cover of Chris Gaines, by the way, which kind of recontextualized that whole thing. Neither here nor there. This is Fiona Apple's time. Please continue.
So yeah, so she's kind of handing in this demo. People are already in disbelief. And I think what we can draw out, or at least a few things I want to kind of like bring up to help people think a little bit more about how she's writing music here. You know, we've mentioned she's got this kind of already ingrained, nearly unconscious feel for music and knows how to work with it. And from that demo, by the way, I think the one song that did make it onto the album that got re-recorded from the demo was Never Is a Promise, which, just as a reminder, means that song, which I would argue is the best song on this record, was written by a literal teenager.
A young teenager.
Yeah, and was so good that it got re-recorded from this demo instead of bringing in, you know, some of the other songs that were there. And I think when we think about that kind of moment of dense talent and the immediate recognition of that talent, and again, like you said, like her self-awareness of that talent. Okay, so everybody is like mindful and present of what's going on so far. I think one interesting thing to draw out is the way that she talked about making this record and turning those songs that she had written into the songs that would be recorded, because I don't want to make this as a label or a statement about the record, but a way to see it and perceive it. This is a very piano-driven record.
Sure.
And one of the reasons that matters is really different from like Coldplay being a piano-driven band, okay? They're a band writing pop songs with piano involved. Fiona Apple is writing piano songs. And the thing that's different about that is that there is no underlying beat. She can choose to spread out the sense of time, the pace, the volume. When it's just a voice and someone who truly knows how to play the piano, you are getting two voices that can create all the dynamics, all the speed, all the energy that you could need out of an entire band. But she's doing it, or she can do it at least, with just herself and the piano. And then partnering here with Andrew Slater, who is, and I would love to encourage everybody to, like, we've talked about the active listening. The production in terms of things like the strings work is so perfect here. And there are a few examples that I'm sure we can draw out. But the thing is, when you listen to this record and just say, okay, no, everyone understood that this was a Fiona Apple singular album and that everything else is in service of these songs that she's written, and we're going to choose the feel of it based on how she plays piano for them, I think is a really helpful way to start hearing and listening to how she does choose to use these songs to. This is what blows me away about it. We talked about it being cerebral. She's talking about what she thinks about her feelings, whereas we're really often hearing more about, like, how does a thing feel? I feel
Right.
so this, that, or the other, right? But she's like really exploring it. And so her ability to control the piano that way, I think, makes these songs so much better, specific ones certainly. But this is coming from someone who said, quote, "I don't want this to be a fucking piano album." And apparently, like, Andy Slater kept saying, this is how you sound. this is you. Stop thinking about it like you're making a piano album. I'm trying to make a you album, and you need the piano for this, right? And like, I think that that's really great because we can feel the tension with her knowing how to write a song, but not quite knowing how to produce it. But then like this final result is a true collaboration that actually does feel more heartfelt. Like it feels like everything was written from day one, complete, ready to go. There's no question. There are like no misses. There are no missteps. And I think that that's one area that we could really talk about and maybe draw some analogies to really help people see how she's using the piano in combination with her ability to write a great song. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think one of the unique things that was drawn out for me was how percussively she plays the piano. Like, I don't know that there's enough piano music in the popular discourse right now or in the past 20 years outside of the fucking Vanessa Carlton song where you can really get a sense of style and tonality around piano playing like you do with guitar players. This is super top of mind for me though, because I just recently watched Song Exploder on Netflix, an extension of one of the only podcasts, in my opinion, worth listening to. And they cover Hurt by Nine Inch Nails, which, you know, I think Trent Reznor is one of the all-time greats. And I do hope we cover Nine Inch Nails at some point. But that is such a great piano song in its own right. And it really is. I mean, he bends piano out of shape. But I was thinking about that song and Trent's use of the piano and the way that it is so percussive and often atonal and used in different ways.
I hurt myself today to see if I still feel. I focus on the pain, the only thing that's real.
Fiona used a tack piano. Like, she used a number of different keyboards on this, but she also used a tack piano to like intentionally bend the piano sound out of shape on this, right? So I think she's fully aware of how unique she is on it. She's also kind of got that John Paul Jones thing where it's like, it would be boring to just do the regular thing with a piano or a guitar or whatever. So I need to come up with my own voice for this because the regular stuff would not suit my actual human body voice. So I really appreciate that. And I think it matches the lushness and uniqueness of her voice. It's a mirror to it. Like, she does some intentionally ugly stuff musically, especially on the piano, because her voice is so good. But she never tries to overdo her voice. She's got that Sade thing. And I love that there's like a straight up Sade song in the middle of this record as well. She never like Whitney Houston's it. I don't even think I know what it sounds like for Fiona Apple to go really big, because she's really quiet and close for most of this record, which is really interesting. They talked about that in the Hurt episode of Song Exploder, where Trent is really close and quiet and intimate and broken. And that's kind of Fiona's whole deal vocally. And so I'm glad I had that little moment of illumination to help me realize that. I think if you want to talk about some of the most interesting vocal stuff, I mean, it's all over this record, but the first good, really easy example is Sullen Girl. There's a lot of crazy Billie Holiday vocal runs all over this thing where it's very modal, right? She'll do a thing and come back to it in a different way and does so effortlessly. So your point about her growing up around music, I think only somebody who really has it all the way in their bones can find those notes between notes. There's blue notes all over this thing.
Under the waves, in the blue of my oblivion. Under the waves, in the blue of my oblivion. It's calm under the waves, in the blue of my oblivion.
And she makes it seem really, really, really easy. And a lot of artists have to really push out their voice to get to some of those interesting places. some of the best vocal Beyonce moments are when she's going really, really huge at the climax of a song. The best Fiona Apple is when she's really dexterous and small and quiet. So to be able to control that power is one of the interesting and unique things about her. I think one of the first things that I texted you when we were really digging in with this record was, I feel like I just stood in Tornado Alley and watched an F5 go by, right? Like she's a force of nature. It's so organic, everything about this record, that I only thought about nature and outside and textures and tactile things. That's how it all makes me feel. I think another analogy that came to mind, we covered Rain Dogs a while back, and the last song, Carry On, is my favorite song on the record. And it winds up into a weird kind of fucked up guitar solo at the end, which reminded me of Mark Ribot on Clap Hands, which is one of my favorite songs. The partnership between Fiona and John Brion, she draws out some of the best stuff from him, and he's done so much. Like, he's done some of the best Frank Ocean stuff, and he's had an equally prolific, unique career like her. So for 2 records that she was able to draw, I think some of still the best work out of him, period, is really, really cool. But when I talk about unexpected moments on the record, again, all in service of the voice and the song. Like, Sullen Girl waves lap over the first 2/3 of that song, and then a Chuck Johnson pedal steel thing just kind of rises from the fog, and you're just like, holy shit, I was not expecting that at all. Same with the guitar solo in Carrion. You even look at Criminal, and I remember having whatever level of this thought I was capable of as a kid when I first saw the Criminal video, but it's got the Chamberlin keyboard, right? The Mellotron type instrument, jazz groove, and then there's the weird, really knifey atonal piano hits in a song that was enormous on MTV, a song that made this record go triple platinum. And the Chamberlin plays the little snake charmer Eastern mode thing, and that's almost like a jazz jam at the end of the song. And she just left it in this song that was like a huge single in 1996 in the almost immediately pre pop-up video era. That shouldn't have happened. It like slipped through the cracks almost. And the record's full of moments like that. So even if you're not into the like singer songwriter focus on the voice part of this, wait 45 seconds and another cool musical thing will happen that takes you by surprise. Also, sorry, the most important part for me as a guy that loves this instrument is like, this is one of the best vibraphone albums outside of jazz that I've ever heard. It's used super tastefully, and it's like a signature on the record. And it really, it's kind of the connective tissue mood wise on the whole thing. You say it's a piano record. Yes, absolutely. Strings come in at just the right time, but like vibes are really the thing on this album that I think are musically kind of a different signature. She loves like percussive stuff used in almost the inverse of the way that it should be used. And that's a really cool thing to me.
to spin the globe and forcefully put my finger on a thing so that you can really start to hear these weird moments. So even not long into Sleep's Dream, the first track on the album, when they get to the bridge and she says, "Don't be so sensitive," listen to how she plays the piano. To me, that's one of your first touch points for what I mean by this is a piano album, in the sense of like the dramatics, the flourishes of it seem to come organically from her understanding how to create moods on a piano.
Don't make it a big deal, don't be so sensitive. We're not playing a game anymore. You don't have to be so defensive. Don't you plead me your case, don't bother to explain. Don't even show me your face, cause it's a crying shame. Just go back to the rock from under which
That's just like literally a thing that can't be played on any other instrument. And it adds to it. It aligns with what she's saying and how she's saying it at the time in a way that both feels like really intense at the moment, but then afterwards like doesn't feel like such an apex, which I feel like is kind of a theme of this stuff. She's able to do these kind of like wild, either percussive or like really like highlighting a sound or a feeling or something really specifically. But as you move past it, it never feels like now the song is just going downhill,
Right.
and it's ending. Like to your point on Carry On, like actually the only complaint I have about this record is actually that solo at the end of that song. It's a
I love it
giant
so
waste
much.
of a guitar solo. Oh my God.
I love, but a good guitar solo is an eloquent way to make fun of guitar solos because they're so that's so like phallic and wanky an idea, right? So the best thing that you can do is to be like, this shit is stupid, and so that's what I appreciate about it. Right? Sorry, Yngwie Malmsteen.
Yeah. Just to do the artist networking and branching out idea, I want to give like a few more quick examples of when we are saying all of these words like a piano album and singer-songwriter and all of this stuff. I really want to try to create a distinct class to put her in to help people understand what else is more like this in the way that we're talking about it.
Spoiler,
as opposed to,
it is not Alanis Morissette.
no, nor is it Chris Gaines. Yeah. So, but like, okay, so let me give a few examples like by instrument. Piano players, think more Regina Spektor. Think John Legend on All of Me. The way that there's nothing else except for the piano and the voice and whatever they want to do with it, especially Regina Spektor. She just like yanks you around rhythmically, right? And she does it with the piano under it. On like a guitar perspective, you're thinking more like Ben Howard's Every Kingdom album, which is just haunting. The way that he uses guitar to amplify the way he wants to sing. That sounds like a really stupid statement coming out of my mouth, but like listening to this collection of artists and thinking about Fiona Apple a little bit more in this way, however you want to label it, I think helps. Another example would be John Mayer's super early work like Inside Wants Out, where it's just him and a guitar. He's storytelling and the guitar is serving him. It is at times percussive and then at other times definitely not. An even better example, honestly, probably the best one I can think of, is Joanna Newsom with a harp. The way that there is nothing, there is no speed, there's no momentum, there's no story except for the artist, and you're hanging on their every word, and the instrument comes along to help tell that story without any underlying rhythm or melody or repetition or anything else like that. Like that kind of helps you get a little bit more in the right mindset, I think, to hear at least most of these songs.
I'm also going to acknowledge an influence that she has explicitly stated that neither of us are going to like, and that's the work of John Lennon. She has called John Lennon her god, and the really piano-y parts of Lennon's solo work, I think, are also kind of a clue. And I'm not exactly sure in what sense, and that is because I have a deep bias against John Lennon in every way. But for all you big Beatles fans out there, there is that. And she also covered Across the Universe, I think, very beautifully. But one of the more recent writings that pointed that out said, well, actually, she's also more kind of like Yoko Ono. One writing, the Jen Pelly Pitchfork review of Fetch the Bolt Cutters, pointed out that Lennon admiration and influence, but Pelly said Fetch the Bolt Cutters feels more conceptually akin to the revolutionary risk-taking of Yoko Ono, a woman who once wrote, I like to fight the establishment by using methods that are so far removed from establishment type thinking that the establishment doesn't know how to fight back. And what I really love about Fiona, if I may infer, is that she would probably at once be like, yeah, I get that. Or she'd be equally likely to be like, oh my God, fuck off. Like, what a load of hot, pretentious garbage. But it's so true. I think that's like how far outside the box she exists. So I appreciate all those comparisons that you just made at the instrument level, but
Yep.
none of them add up to the gestalt of all of those multitudes are contained in one revolutionary body that is Fiona Apple. But those are really great and widely varied touch points. But I think you also got to add it all up to more of a Björk type level. It's
Totally.
all those things plus it's this person. So you got to put it over here in this other category by itself.
Yeah, this is just, it's one of those places where genres fail us,
Yep.
but in a way that they were kind of designed to fail. It's not that calling it piano rock is wrong. It's just that it will bring to mind the wrong people. And like, I just want to set you on a different path.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And to that point, and we've mentioned it a few times too, she was fully aware of the fact that she was aware of how to write a hit, period. And so this comes up almost in urban legend fashion with Criminal, which we've talked about, because the supposed story was like the record label wants another hit. They need a hit. She says, you know, basically, again, in the urban legend version, fuck you, fine. I'll write this. And she writes Criminal in 45
I believe
minutes.
100% of it, by the way, even if 50% of it is true. I choose to live in that world.
The urban legend part to me is the like projecting the youthful punk vibe onto her, because
Oh,
like when
sure.
when I read this quote, I'm like, I don't actually hear so much frustration as I hear confidence. Like just raw, yes, you wanted another hit, fine, go to lunch and I'll crank this out. Like fine, I'll get it done. You don't have to not like the work for it to be a fun story. I don't understand.
Even lyrically, I don't know what I thought the song was about. Is maybe like guilt, I guess, because it's called Criminal. Again, the narrative around the video was so one thing and it projected all this male gaze bullshit onto her. But I read the lyrics and I was like, dude, she's like Thanos. A girl can do whatever to a boy just because she can. It's her standing in her own power. And I'd never seen that context of it until I really looked at the lyrics for the first time. And just the casual confidence of it, I think is so great. But I love that it's her Black Sabbath's Paranoid, you know, written on a lunch break. And then it became this enormous thing because it's this pure id of a superhuman talent. I appreciate that very much.
And frankly, we don't usually do this, but like in the same way that we talk about wanting to pick an album up a little bit and shake off the dust, I would love to even pick up Criminal just a little bit more. I mean, it's a great pop song. Yes, it's also the first time we see some of the like standard pop production stuff like vocal doubling, which is also wild when you think about it. You have not on this album, as far as I could tell, up to this point, heard a vocal double of her, period.
Oh yeah, good call.
Verses, choruses, bridges, anything. And so not only is it a great pop song, yes, not only did she write it in this 45-minute fashion, and that's all great, but to your point about really reading the lyrics, like it's a moment worth focusing on, especially for anyone listening who hasn't thought about this recently, because the song is effectively about her feeling a guilt and shame for using her body intentionally to get something that she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a celebration of it, which is sort of what got projected onto the song in the video. Was like, oh, you're glorifying this, right? She got called an underfed Calvin Klein model. It was described as heroin chic. And then in one of the most insulting things I can possibly imagine, it was described as having overtones of child porn in a video with a singer who is on the record having been abused as a child. I had to like stop taking notes at a moment when I read that for the level of wildly offensive that is. But again, these are just like other forms of music and culture that we try to talk about. Like these are such snapshots of who we are. She is pointing out the feeling, the thought process of experiencing the guilt of realizing she used her body to get something, and she's putting it out there. The video is about that feeling. And yet she receives, and you can still read about it, article after article, reference after reference, a ton of attention and criticism because people assumed that this was just a song glorifying the idea of using your body to get things. It's like, it's literally the opposite of what she is trying to talk about. And it's just worth picking up because it's important, I think, for us to like really see ourselves culturally sometimes. And so like, not only did we do the classic misrepresentation of a song, but like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, like this kind of like snowballs and turns into something different to where when me and you were going back and like really reading reviews from the time, I mean, this like literally these are quotes. There was a New York Times review of the album at the time, and a quote was, which you mentioned, she quote plays a Lolita-ish suburban party girl in this music video, according to the New York Times. And the title of that review was A Message Far Less Pretty Than the Face. Like, I want to burn an entire decade of music journalism down when I read stuff like that.
Luckily, it's just their political coverage and op-eds that suck now. So thanks, old gray old lady.
But like, I hope we're being clear about one of the things we can do with this podcast with going back to older albums and songs is like just pick them up out of whatever they might be mired in when you might not even realize that that's kind of like where it's cataloged in your brain, especially if you're a Gen Xer, right? And you were like exactly the target audience for this moment in time. If you have kind of a weird mental taste in your mouth, so to speak, about this record at all, it's worth examining whether it's a result of some of this hugely fucked up reaction to the music that was coming out then, both like for the content of the music itself and just this is a wildly inappropriate thing to be saying about a person, period.
Yeah. I almost don't want to call out specifically any of the really bad journalism around it, but like she has specifically cited, if you go down a rabbit hole with the things she points back to, eventually you're going to find them anyway. So one thing that gave her pause around the media was a Spin cover story in 97 that was arguably as bad an offender as the New York Times review. And there's a lot of objectification type shit in it, but there's also casual things like title was released in the breakout era of women in rock. Like, I love how we just rediscover we rediscover that people of color and women exist and like haven't magically been the backbone of all of society the whole time. We put our 3D glasses back on and there they are in the background. You're going to love this next bit in that same paragraph. Jewel and Joan Osborne held MTV by the throat that summer. That's a cool writing. And according to the media, women were the new Seattle. Who wrote this? John Weir. What a winner. That article is called Girl Trouble. Let's lean all the way in.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Pop's newest star is barely 20, still lives with her parents, and doesn't have a driver's license. Swipe right. So what is Fiona Apple doing half naked all over MTV? I don't know, John. Get the fuck
I wish
off the
y'all could
internet.
see the like rapid activity of Kyle's eyebrows as he like mockingly reads this stuff.
I'm a guy
Great.
that craves violence anyway, and it's very hard to tamp down those urges as a 230-pound Irish Aries when I read stuff like that. Anyway, John Weir, hope you're doing great, buddy. Hope the loneliness hasn't gotten to you yet.
It's so important to hammer on this stuff because you'll miss so much about this album if you don't have a clear head about it and you don't approach it, for lack of a better term, like an adult, hearing from another adult. Like, you have to remove the actuality of her age or the facts of her age at that point a little bit in order to really engage with this, because the phrase ahead of its time gets used way too much. But like in terms of her life trajectory, like the songwriting she's cranking out here is like ahead of her own time.
Yep.
It's hard to believe. And so if you don't come at it with the right perspective, you'll miss so many of the details that we've talked about so far. And like, I just want to leave people with a few more to listen for, because that's really what changed listening to this for me, as opposed to individual songs, going a little bit more in the direction of like individual pieces of art, as almost silly as that sounds. Like letting each song come to you differently means you can do things like, one of my favorite things on Sleep to Dream, for instance, is she like, listen to the way that she's controlling her voice. There's at no point does that song really start to resolve in the way that you expect it to. And several times she even intentionally builds towards an unexpected change. And that's kind of a theme throughout this album, actually, is like in one of the reasons it was important to unearth it being a piano album is because it does not almost ever follow your like 1-4-5-1 type of progression. She's doing wild piano chords under it. And with her vocals, she's actually smoothing out the chord transitions. She doesn't jump intervals very much when she sings, which is an interesting tidbit because actually she sets you up in the music to expect her to jump intervals, which is one of the things I like the most about it. But specifically Sleep to Dream, not only building things up, but just like having that sense of internalized rage that she's sort of perpetuating through her vocals. She's not just singing a song, like she's telling you about a thing. That's just in the first track. I kept repeating that one over and over again just to listen to details like that.
Don't you plead me your case, don't bother to explain. Don't even show me your face, cause it's a crying shame. Just go back to the rock from under which you came. Take the sorrow you gave and all the stakes you claim. And don't forget the blame. I got my feet on the ground and I don't go to sleep to dream. You got your head in the clouds and you're not at all what you seem.
That's an unbelievable single, by the way. And you talk about going back to what I said about propulsion. That's I think kind of the peak example. That to me is like a hip hop song. Like when she was talking about production touch points with John Brion and Andrew Slater, she talked about Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday on the one hand and hip hop kind of on the other, along sort of the same continuum. And I think you hear all of those things. And if you wrote that out on paper, that sounds like a horrendous experiment ready to go off the rails. But I think it speaks to her that it just, all those multitudes can kind of exist as points along the same axes. And it's a thing that works. I remember watching a deconstruction video on YouTube of Tuesday by McConan and Drake, and he plays the chord, let's air quotes, progression on the piano, breaking it down to just that element. And he points out how it never really resolves itself. And again, I'm not like a trained musician, right? I always look to you for those cues about what am I feeling unconsciously and like technically what is being pulled off to make that happen. And I think Sleep to Dream is a great example of that, where the gear never catches on purpose, right? Because she's not trying to get out of that feeling necessarily and make it resolve. The closest that she does is don't make it a big deal, don't be so sensitive, where it just crescendos a little and then it comes right back to a simmer, to a low boil. And that every bit of that is controlled. That's Coltrane level shit, but she's doing it as a singer songwriter where it just pulses. Doesn't quite drone and it doesn't quite pop arc. That's masterful.
Yeah. And, you mentioned earlier Shadow Boxer, which has plenty to dissect in there, but like two things I wanted to draw out that are both related to what you're saying here. First of all, I think considering the topic of Shadow Boxer, if you think about the way that song would normally feel with that topic, right? I mean, it's all the way in there with the like, I'm shadow boxing, baby. I'm figuring out what you're going to do. I want to be ready for your move, right? This song drags on in swings almost, really slowly, in a way that really doesn't match up with what you would expect from the idea of shadow boxing. But to me, again, this is where it became cerebral for me, because a lot of times we talk about, little Bob Ross happy accidents that happen with artists who like accidentally make something more meaningful than they, intended. This one feels like if you applied shadow boxing to a relationship, it never happens fast.
Right.
It's slow. It's over time. It draws out. It feels almost longer and shorter than it should at the same time. Like it's got this really great sense of off-kilterness in this song, which I think, again, kind of builds into this theme, which is something we would expect from someone writing music for 30 years, not necessarily on their debut album.
It's like she was visualizing the ESPN top 10 highlights of a relationship, watching the montage play out, and the time and the editing of that would be really off kilter with up and down moments. The swing of that piano rhythm really cuts through. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And I especially couldn't we couldn't do this episode without going a little bit further into Never Is a Promise. I mentioned that earlier. Like I really love this song. It really blows me away every time. It was on that original demo, which is even wilder. But like a few things to draw out here, because I think if nothing else, I would argue this song is the best kind of like microcosm of all of the things that are happening on this record to draw out her prose. First of all, just like the line in general, but as the scenery grows, I see in different lights, the shades and shadows undulate in my perception, is a stop, turn off your phone, disconnect from the internet line.
But as the scenery grows, I see in different lights. The shades and shadows undulate in my perception. My feelings swell and stretch, I see from greater heights. I understand what I am still too proud.
But especially inside the context of a song with this kind of, I feel like it's hinting at the simplicity of a usual pop song. Like Never Is a Promise really feels like an idea that could be pretty easily executed by pretty much anyone who's writing a song with 30 other people and cranking it out for pop. And yet to have something that feels like a simple premise and then have lines like shades and shadows undulate in my perception is that push and pull that she's doing on purpose herself. And there's nothing else that's really doing that in the music other than her choice to contrast these things together. And then to really draw out like the vocals and the way that she uses that. You know, I mentioned that she does this a little bit on Sleep to Dream, but specifically dig into the hurts me deeper line on Never Is a Promise, because she knows what she's doing because she's a musician. She builds in a way that you can't possibly imagine that she's going to not resolve at the end of the way that she builds up and goes towards what seems like a larger chorus, a key change, anything. And she doesn't. Actually, if you go back and listen to it, the music never shifts at all. It's entirely her voice and the way that she chooses to interact with the chords that she's playing.
You'll never feel the heat of this song. My fever burns me deeper than I've ever shown to you. You say don't fear your dreams. It's easier than it seems. You say you'll never let me.
And then to wrap it really all up, like we mentioned the production and the way that the production matters here because the instrumentation matters a lot here. And on this song specifically, Van Dyke Park did a lot of string work here, and like the work on
Don't
Never
gloss
Is a-
over that.
Okay.
Fucking Van Dyke Park did a string arrangement. That's not a casual thing. If you don't know Van Dyke Park, go look up Van Dyke Park. And she just casually got a Van Dyke Park string arrangement on this record. Unbelievable.
And it's masterful. It will
Yep.
make sense to you when you listen specifically to the way the strings work in that song.
Yep.
But like with those three things, I feel like if you've got an interest in whatever lit our fire about this album, because like there's like an indescribable thing about it.
It's got an X factor for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you're interested in it, or like it's confusing to you that we would be so excited about it or whatever, like I encourage you to dig into those three facets on that one particular song to see if you can start hearing the way that she's experimenting with music to tell you a story or to tell you a thing, as opposed to trying to listen to it like an album all the way through the way you would a lot of other music. If you're not in the right headspace, this is a fine record, I guess. It's passable, but like it won't really make a difference to you. But it really turns over a new leaf when you face it and look at it and pay a lot of attention to it.
With Never Is a Promise specifically, you made the comparison in the show notes as a way of illustrating Fiona's thinking about feeling. You put it perpendicular to Anti by Rihanna, which we covered recently, and a direct side-by-side comparison that you can do for fun to Never Is a Promise is Love on the Brain by Rihanna.
Babe, I'm fist fighting with fire.
just to get close to you. Could we burn something today? And I'll run for miles just to get a taste. Must be love on the brain that's got me feeling this way. It beats me black and blue, but
So if you want to see how traditionally that type of direction of a piano ballad that swells could be done, Love on the Brain, and I mean no disrespect whatsoever by painting Love on the Brain in that light, because
Right.
I think I said on that episode that song makes me cry like with regularity when she takes it up to the swell place. It's a $10,000 fireworks show, but Fiona could do that with sort of the same bones here on Never Is a Promise, and she doesn't. And it mirrors the lack of resolve in the lyrical subject matter. And that's, for the second time, I'm going to bring up John Paul Jones on this episode, just that he can play two different instruments with his hands and his feet at the same time. She can do that with her voice as an instrument and an actual instrument. That's genius. That's kind of as good as it gets.
The only thing I wanted to tack on there, since you did bring it up, I don't know why, but it's been really difficult for me to not want to do an entire episode about Anti and Tidal matched up beside each other, because not only is what you're saying true, and I thought it was interesting, but you flip this around. The First Taste on this record could be done by Rihanna tomorrow and would be the club hit of the year.
Mm-hmm. That's the Sade kind of sounding song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just bump up the bass, but like it's got exactly what like 2019, 2020 club music does, right? It's got those kind of like light, percussive, hollow feels and like a really chill vocal line.
It's got like an Afro-Caribbean beat.
Oh, your love give me a heart contusion. Does your breezes fill my skin with sudden weight? You're hungry for
Yeah. I don't know. It was just an interesting way to kind of re-examine that, because First Taste almost stands out as like one of the most pop oriented songs, despite it not necessarily being the biggest single.
Right.
I could personally go on for hours, and I don't necessarily want that from myself, much less for the people forced to listen to this. But this is just yet another, like, for anyone who's listened to, even a handful of episodes for us, like, I know that we kind of oscillate between like, here's a record we love and we've never not loved this record and let's talk about it. And then over on this other kind of side is like, here's a thing that we're not sure if we loved or not, but we paid a lot of attention to it and we learned, and like maybe there were some interesting things about it. But every now and then something kind of hits right in the middle where it's like, oops, I accidentally have a new favorite album now, and I really didn't mean for that to happen. And this is one of those. Like, I'm not done listening to this, and I've been listening to it intently for 2 months.
Yeah. And that's the joy of this podcast now creeping up on 50 episodes. And I know there are lots of podcasts out there with hundreds of episodes, but I think this is as good a moment as any to stop down and reflect on why we don't do more of them. Because one, nobody's asking for that. Two, we're not doing it as a job. We're not sponsored, anything like that. This remains a pure of heart art project for us to just remember how to love the thing we love the most in the world and kind of live our lives accordingly, right? I mean, this is a very meditative practice for me, and I couldn't possibly overstate the impact of doing this with you that it's had on my life and the way that I view everything. Things like this, experiences like this, thousands of artists later and thousands of live shows later, 2 decades of really intensive music discovery and listening on. These moments get harder to come by, but when they do, they're so much sweeter. And all too often now, I think the thread we're finding again and again is they're right under our nose in these like this was a 3 times platinum album, and I would leave MTV on for the Criminal video to come on because it was so compelling to me when I was younger and it had a mystique. So going back to the original point that you made, going back and recontextualizing and rediscovering this record is not only about the record itself and appreciating a piece of music in a new way, but it's also like, what mirror does this hold up to me? And then I know that's like kind of a sappy tangent, but you have mentioned a couple of different times, if this is probably not your thing, well, thanks for listening to this much of this episode and getting to this point anyway, and even indulging us on that point. But in 2021, now a few months in, please let this be a reminder to return to your spirit of openness and letting music be the thing that makes you the best possible version of yourself. Because all of that is unlocked with a key like this record. And we debated the merits of calling Fiona Apple superhuman, like Jen Pelly does in her article, that she said specifically the strength it requires to be vulnerable in the way that Fiona is specifically is superhuman, that it takes to harness your pain and make it dance is as rare as gifts come. There's just a lot of power in a record like this in words and in sounds. And whether or not you want to compare Fiona Apple to LeBron James, or you just want to, maybe that's too mythological and you just want to say, damn, she's been really good and talented. And what does that mean? With a lot of artists and albums, that kind of bar raising, whether you agree with it or not, can be kind of alienating, right? It feels like you're beneath it. But there's something so inviting about this record and the way that she pulls it off. You know, she made 78 demo copies, and the first one got into somebody's hands and exploded their brain. I hope this encourages you, wherever you are, to revisit not only your fandom with music, but whatever your thing is, and open back up and look at it with new possibilities and energy and enthusiasm and a sense of hope, which has been so hard to come by the past 18, 24, whatever months. And how nice would it be to find that again?
Yeah. I'd love to end with a quote from her that I feel like really maps to that. She said, "I can write a hit. I know how that shit works. But, and I'm not trying to be modest or anything, am I really that much more authentic? Is it really that bad out there? Yes. Yes, it is. And we're like really glad that this album existed. And I'm really glad that we can take opportunities like this to decide, what are we bringing to our listening experience when we pick up an album like this? And is it helpful for us to bring along our cultural ideas, the things that we remember, or our preconceived notions about what an 18-year-old should be able to produce? We need to evaluate, like, if you want to take music seriously as an art form in the way that people like Fiona Apple mean it, you actually have to evaluate what you bring to every situation like this and decide, is what I believe and what I think about this actually helpful, or is it getting in the way of me being able to hear what someone is trying to tell me or show me or help me experience? And so, like, I want more people, like you've said, to have that kind of experience with music. But in order to do it, sometimes you do have to sit down and deconstruct what's getting in the way of me hearing little details like the piano flourish on Don't Be So Sensitive. If you aren't hearing that the first time, take a pause, rewind, and ask yourself why you missed it. Are you doing something else? Like, were you listening for something different? These are the types of tools I think that, like, me and you, like, as we've gone along, I love telling people how much we learn and experience differently by choosing to listen to music like this, like in this fashion. Mm-hmm. And it's super rewarding. And here's another place where, as opposed to a Husker Du or a Melvins album where we can be like, listen, active listening, shit, just put it on his skate, dude. Like, as you know, as opposed to something like that, like, this is a deeply rewarding experience and a fantastic entry to what would become just a phenomenal catalog over the last couple of decades.
Yeah. You made me think of the 5 whys. Like, how do you get to the questions that you don't even know to ask? Fiona Apple will get you to that. Why am I stuck in this way? Why can I not hear more? That all reminds me of a time we went and saw a band and I hated the opener, and somebody was like, give it up for the opener. And I was like, they sucked. And he was like, it's all just music, man. And, and I've never been so thrown off course by a casual, flippant, drunk remark by a lead singer of a rock and roll band or
you just out 311'd me, dude. Crazy.
And that was the moment that made me stop being like, this sucks or this is good, and just being like, this didn't resonate with me or this is not for me. Right. So that was a moment that got me unstuck, and I feel like genuinely made me a better person. So there's a lot when we talk about how this podcast made us better people. And by we, I mean me. I don't know. You were more enlightened than me all along. It's one of those things where like you ask the 5 whys and you get to a new and different thing with this music. And then you start extrapolating that into the concentric circles of how you appreciate everything in your life.
Yes.
How food
Oh my
tastes
God.
and all that sort of stuff. But Tidal is a really potent place for us personally. And I hope that everybody can find experiences or touch points like that, like this one was for us.
Won't do no good to hold no stand.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win a free vinyl copy of the album we just covered. And follow us on Instagram and Twitter for even more info about the album, including playlists, links to interesting articles and videos, and even some stories that didn't make the episode. Most importantly, though, please support your favorite local record store or concert venue, or buy merch from a band you love. Thanks for listening.
Honey, I've gone